Okay, we are going to begin this next panel, which is entitled Governance, Corruption, and Barriers to Reform. It is moderated by Dr. Renad Mansour, the director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House.
No? Okay. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel entitled Corruption and Barriers to Reform. So very easy topics that I'm sure we'll get through and find great solutions for. But very lucky to have the panelists with us to be discussing the different perspectives of corruption that we want to, oh, that's better, okay. The different perspectives of corruption that we want to go through. So all of them need no introduction, but I'll just, for the sake of conversation, introduce each one of them. Judge Haider Hanoun Zair, President of the Commission of Integrity in the Government of Iraq. Simona Foltin, journalist and filmmaker. Yama Turabi, Anti-Corruption Chief Technical Advisor for the UNDP. Dr. Zaid Al-Ali, Senior Program Manager on Constitution Building, International IDEA. And last but certainly not least, my friend Dr. Bilal Wahab, the Nathan and Esther K. Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute. So this will be a conversation rather than speeches. The topic is corruption, but a specific type of corruption, which is the system. And I have three questions in general that I think it's important to discuss. First of all, Iraq is an interesting country, and every politician I meet is anti-corruption. So everyone here is certainly anti-corruption, and we all want to fight corruption, and somehow it doesn't seem to go away. So I think that question we need to think about. Also, a country with a budget that can go well above $100 billion a year doesn't seem to have electricity or medicine or basic services. So let's also talk about what are the consequences of corruption in such a wealthy country. And you know, not just to keep it as pessimistic, but what are the solutions to this? What can be done? If it's something that is the system, if corruption is a design rather than a flaw, then what can be done to tell people who are benefiting from corruption to benefit less or to not benefit at all? And so we're very lucky to have a conversation, and I apologize in advance if I do cut you off, but it's great to keep interventions only to a few minutes, and we can have follow-up questions so that we can also get to the audience. So I'd like to begin with Judge Sayyid Al-Qadi, and I'll speak in English because just to keep it consistent. You're tasked with heading the Commission of Integrity. Your job, you're at the front of the fight against corruption. Of course, it's impossible to say that you will defeat or end corruption, but where can you begin? What are your priorities? How do you begin your job?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدات والسادة الحضور، السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا لصاحب الدعوة الكريمة فخامة الدكتور برهم صالح المحترم. هيئة النزاهة هيئة اتحادية مستقلة وفقا لنص المادة 102 من دستور جمهورية العراق لسنة 2005. تعمل وفق قانون هيئة النزاهة والكسب غير المشروع رقم 30 لسنة 2011 المعدل والقوانين ذات العلاقة وتحت مظلة القضاء. هيئة النزاهة في هذه المرحلة المهمة من تاريخ العراق بعد أن قدمت الحكومة برنامجها الحكومي ومنهاجها الوزاري الذي تصدره أولوية وهي مكافحة الفساد، أصبحت على هيئة النزاهة أن تسعى لأن تقوم بواجبها ومهمتها على أكمل وجه، وتحاول أن تقدم في مجال مكافحة الفساد ما تستطيع أن تقدمه بعد أن غيبت عن ساحة مكافحة الفساد في الفترات الماضية. توجهت الحكومات السابقة لإنشاء كيانات فرعية لربما بعضها غير دستورية، أخذت من هيئة النزاهة عملها، وبالنتيجة لم تنجح عملية مكافحة الفساد لأن الحكومات السابقة لم تذهب إلى المؤسسة المختصة بمكافحة الفساد وهي هيئة النزاهة، وتدعم من قدراتها وإمكانياتها في هذا المجال. هيئة النزاهة في المرحلة الحالية بعد أن حصلت على هذا الدعم من خلال توجه حكومي وسياسي حقيقي في مكافحة الفساد، بالإضافة إلى دعم قضائي حقيقي في هذا المجال وترسيخ لقواعد القانون وحماية قانونية لها ولكوادرها ضمن مظلة القانون، تسعى بأن تقدم صورة جديدة عن هذا المجال بعد أن أوصلنا لكوادرنا في هيئة النزاهة أن عمل هيئة النزاهة في الوقت الحاضر هو عمل يتصل بالجانب الوطني والجانب بقاء الدولة من عدمه. أصبح تحدي الفساد للدولة تحدي خطير، يقول الفساد أما أنا أو الدولة، فعلينا أن نقول للفساد أما نحن أم أنت. الفساد خطير، الفساد كبر وتجذر في العراق وأصبح ظاهرة، على الرغم أنه الفساد في كل دول العالم، لكن في العراق تجذر بسبب أننا أصبغنا على الفساد صبغات غير شرعية وغير قانونية وغير دستورية. أصبح الفاسد يتصف بصفات مقدسة وحصانات، عندما نقول الفاسد الفلاني، الوزير الفلاني، المسؤول الفلاني، كأننا نحتدي على مؤسسة كاملة، وألصق صفة المؤسسة به فأصبحت له حصانة أولى. الفساد حمته الكلمة الحرة، عندما تم شراء الكلمة الحرة بالماء الفاسد أصبحنا لا نميز بين الكلمة الحقيقية والفساد وغير الفساد، وأصبحت الكلمة الحرة تبتز تحت مظلة الفساد. معوقات كثيرة أمام هيئة النزاهة وليست تحديات. من يتحدى هيئة النزاهة في هذا الوقت سيخسر، وأني أقدم لكم هذا الوعد وأنا مسؤول عنه. سنقدم كل شيء لكي نكسر هامة الفساد ونضعها تحت أقدام أبناء الشعب المضحي الذي قتله الفساد قبل أن يقتله الإرهاب. ضاع من العراق أيام شبابه بعد أن تغير النظام البائد، وأصبحنا أمام نظام ديمقراطي يعطي للأشخاص وللمواطنين حقوقهم. ضاعت فترة شباب هذا العهد وهذا النظام من خلال الفساد، وأصبحنا في مجال شيخوخة لهذا النظام إن لم نسرع ونعطيه جرعات من الحياة. الفساد ليس خطر فقط على إفقار الشعب وإفقار الناس، بل هو خطر على المؤسسة الديمقراطية، وخطر على سيادة القانون ومؤسسات إنفاذ القانون، جميعا في خطر. ولربما عندما يقول نحن في مرحلة عصيبة ومرحلة مفترق طرق، صحيح، لأننا إذا بقينا على هذا الحال فإن الفساد إذا أكل من أطراف الدولة سيأكل مركزها. فعلينا أن نقدم مسرعين لمكافحة الفساد. آليات مكافحة الفساد لدينا كثيرة، نعمل بجد ونشاط من خلال أولاً عندما شكلنا الهيئة العليا لمكافحة الفساد، وهي ليست هيئة فرعية وإنما هي هيئة من ضمن هيئة النزاهة، كان واجبها هي التسريع واختصار الوقت والجهد في مجال إنجاز الملفات المهمة والخطيرة. فحققنا من خلاله أولاً أنه تم من خلاله والتفاهم مع مجلس القضاء الأعلى والدكتور المحترم دكتور فايق رئيس مجلس القضاء الأعلى المحترم اللي هو الداعم لهذه الهيئة، من خلاله اختصرنا أنه نقل القضايا المهمة من المحافظات إلى مركز هيئة النزاهة وعرضها على قاضي المختص اللي يختص بعمل الهيئة العليا لمكافحة الفساد، بالإضافة إلى وجود فريق ساند تنفيذي ينفذ لقرارات هذه الهيئة. كذلك توجهنا من خلال إلغاء القرارات التي كانت تعطي انطباع سيء عن هيئة النزاهة. نحن حاليا أمام مبدأ هو خضوع الحاكمين للقانون، خضوع المحكومين له. كان في هيئة النزاهة بعض الاستثناءات عندما كانت تضع العراقيل أمام القضايا أو الإخبارات التي تحرك أمام الدرجات الخاصة والعليا في الدولة، كان هنالك أمر يتعلق بأنه تعرض الإخبارات التي تقدم ضد الدرجات الخاصة على رئيس الهيئة ليقرر ما يشاء بشأنها. ألغيت هذه الاستثناءات وأصبح الإخبار يقدم لأي مكتب من مكاتبنا أو مديرياتنا في المحافظات وكذلك في مركز بغداد، ويذهب مباشرة كأي إخبار آخر بحق أي موظف آخر.
شكرا.
نعم.
كمل.
هذه نقول عمل هيئة النزاهة ومكافحة الفساد مساحة واسعة، الكلام كثير فيه لكن الجهد متواصل. نحتاج بالإضافة إلى جهد هو عمل الأمة وهو أبناء الشعب. إذا لم يدعم أبناء الشعب هيئة النزاهة في هذه المرحلة، والذي نعمل على أنه نبث فيه حالة التثقيف، وهو من واجباتنا أيضا تثقيف الشعب وتأهيله لأن يكون داعم لمكافحة الفساد ويكون جزء من عملية مكافحة الفساد وليس جزءا من الفساد. كذلك تأهيل القطاع الخاص ليكون عونا لهيئة النزاهة ولأجهزة الرقابية التي تسعى في مكافحة الفساد، وليس أن يكون في الجانب الآخر وعونا للفاسدين. العمل كثير أنا وأشكر استماعكم والسلام عليكم.
شكرا جزيلا سيد القاضي.
بارك الله فيك.
Moving on to Dr. Zaid, the commissioner, the head of the Integrity Commission, talked about corruption as ruining the democratic institutions. He mentioned special grades and different mechanizations of corruption. From your perspective, your vantage point, is there a way to begin combating corruption in this country?
Okay, so first of all, thanks Renad, and thanks everyone for being here, particularly of course President Saleh for the very generous invitation, and of course to the University of Sulaimani. It's great to be here again, and what I'd like to start doing, if it's okay with Renad, it won't take a minute, is just to read some notes that I have on my screen here that I prepared. I have a timer. You have a timer, great, okay. So the notes are as follows. So proposals for reform have been on the table for years now. And plans were put forth years ago to reform the judiciary and transform it into a real check against executive overreach. But very little has been done. So what I've done just there is something that's perhaps not very nice, is that I've read to you the notes that I prepared for a session that I sat on here 8 years ago, okay? I sat, I think, on this very chair 8 years ago, and I spoke about corruption, and those are the notes that I prepared for myself, okay? And here we are, Renad is asking me, is there something that can be done? There's lots of things that could be done, but they haven't been done, right? And is there anything different today in the current political environment that encourages me to think that something might be done? I would say no, I don't think so. I mean, there's no reason to think that anything has changed currently in the current environment, right? You know, and I was very interested in the previous session that Sayyid Qubab Talabani talked about the need for a conversation about oil and gas and so on and so forth. And yes, I think, Toby, you're right in your interpretation of what he said. You know, so, but the call for a conversation about that specific topic is very, very welcome. But we equally need a very deep and serious conversation about Iraq's legal framework, its anti-corruption framework, its constitution, right? The last time we had a meaningful conversation about that was in 2005 in the calamitous constitutional process that was masterful in its lack of organization. We really sincerely need a deep conversation about these things. It's been way, way too long, very, very overdue. It takes a lot of work. Prime Minister Abadi said earlier that he's willing to do, we have to work hard, I think is what he said. That's terrific. You know, this type of event is extremely useful as a call for action, but to have a serious, deep conversation about the anti-corruption framework, the legal framework, and the types of changes that you need, it takes a huge amount of organization and planning, and mainly political will, which is, you said, everyone talks about anti-corruption, but nothing's done, right? So therefore, where is the political will?
Thank you for a great and concise answer. Simona, turning over to you, a lot of your work has featured the impact of corruption. And you know, we often sit on these panels and we discuss the politics and the networks and the state, non-state, all of this. But what does corruption actually look like in the everyday lives of Iraqis for the last 20 years?
Thank you, Renat, and thank you to AOIS. It's great to be here, and thank you, Dr. Barham, for having us. I'd like to take the heist of the century as an example because it's something that I spent quite a lot of time reporting on, and I think it offers a lot of really interesting insights and potentially lessons learned for how the government should perhaps tackle corruption. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it involved the theft of at least $2.5 billion from the coffers of the tax authority, which falls under the Ministry of Finance. And this happened between 2021 and 2022. The corruption scandal came to light last year, but until now there hasn't really been proper accountability. I think the key takeaways when we look at this specific scandal is that it really tells us that in Iraq, graft is practiced by consensus. It is not done by one specific side. There is a fundamental agreement between political elites that they will line their pockets with state funds. And I think the same way we see the distribution of government positions between different political parties in what we know as the muhassasa, there was in a way a muhassasa within this corruption scandal. So to attribute it to just one specific side would be to politicize the issue, and that is something that is not very helpful. If we look at how it unfolded specifically, there was a member of parliament who proposed the lifting of a crucial audit function, which was then approved by the Prime Minister's office, which was then executed within the Ministry of Finance. Then there was the Rafidain Bank, which is a government-owned entity, which allowed the dispersal of these funds. The central bank, which has an oversight function, didn't intervene. The Integrity Commission and the Chamber of Audit also failed in their oversight function. So you can really see how there are a lot of institutions that were involved, all of whom were either directly complicit or at least failed in their duty to execute their functions. I think and Judge Haider already mentioned that there is a need to reform and improve the strength of the Integrity Commission, and I think that is something very important because, as Prime Minister Soudani admitted himself when he first came to office, the oversight bodies like the Integrity Commission and the Audit Chamber actually failed in their duties to stop this theft. They either issued letters that allowed it to continue or turned a blind eye, and I think it raises a lot of question about how these bodies are run and whether they're able to really crack down on corruption. When I went to the tax authority to investigate this story, I saw a poster next to the elevator which called on whistleblowers to report any corruption. And they did. There were individuals, small employees within the tax authority that saw what was going on, and they did report it, and the Integrity Commission failed to take action. Instead, those who reported it, they were penalized, they were moved to other positions, they were threatened. So there is, in general, in all government institutions, a climate of fear to actually speak out against corruption and to do anything about it because people understand that they will not get backing, that nothing will be done to actually put an end to these scandals. Now, if we look at how the government has handled the investigation and the accountability process after this came to light, I think there's also quite a few issues here. First of all, there has been a real focus on recovering the stolen funds as opposed to bringing those responsible to account. One of the main individuals who was initially arrested, who was a businessman who was said to be one of the main accused, was later released to help in the recovery of funds. Other than that, there haven't really been any major arrests. And that raises a lot of questions about the role of the judiciary, because ultimately it is their responsibility to identify the culprits and arrest them. And it casts a lot of doubt about whether that is being done independently and transparently. Moreover, some people inside the Ministry of Finance and the Tax Commission who are suspected of being responsible for the scandal have not been removed from their positions. To the contrary, they've been assigned new responsibilities. They have been moved to other departments, for example, the Customs Commission, where they're suspected to continue to embezzle funds. We have seen lately a number of arrest warrants issued against officials within the former Prime Minister's office. And I think, there is a great risk that the investigation is politicized. Because as I said, the culprits were from across the political spectrum, and it is important for the government to really pursue these individuals in a fair and balanced way, so it doesn't create the impression that only certain people are being targeted because maybe they belong to the former government. So that is something I think the current government really has to pay attention to. And the lack of results, which is now I think six months after this came to light, it really hurts the government. It really hurts this relationship between the public and the government. Prime Minister Soudani said that one of the biggest challenges he is facing is to restore the confidence between the people and the government. But the lack of accountability for crimes like these is not exactly helping that process. So I think we should really take a critical look at all of the bodies that are responsible for bringing corrupt officials to account and have a very honest conversation about why that is not happening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simone, especially for differentiating the punitive part of going after the corrupt, but also ensuring it doesn't happen again. And those are two conversations that need to be had, but only one is being had at the moment, and I think it's important to include the second. Dr. Bilal, turning to you with a similar question, the focus perhaps on the Kurdistan region. Of course, the Kurdistan region is also connected to the networks of corruption that we see across the country. What are you seeing? How do you view the prospects of overcoming these barriers of reform, overcoming corruption in the Iraqi government, but also in the Kurdistan region, if you may?
Thank you, Renad, and you set us up early on very well, and I'm only complimenting what my colleagues have already said, but I'd be remiss not to thank AUIS, especially the alumni community, which is an army of minds and energy that are running this forum, which I'm thrilled that it's back. So let's give it up to the students of AUIS, please. So what I'm obviously very biased to this institution. I used to teach here for 4 years. I had a class, I introduced a class, I think on my second year, that was called Corruption. And so, it was a semester long in which I would, week after week, we'll talk about what is corruption, how do you define corruption, and what are the impacts of corruption. So we would spend time on, corruption is bad for economic development. Corruption is bad for the legitimacy of the governing system. Corruption discourages political participation and voting. Oh, and then ISIS happens. So he said, oh, look, the books were right. Corruption actually undermines the state stability and creates opportunities for financing terrorist groups, but also undermining the legitimacy and the capacity of your security forces. So all of these academic and theoretical linkages, I think it would be nice if the course is still being taught at the UIS, but I don't think we need it anymore. It has become common sense. I think everyone living in this country basically understands how corruption works, what corruption is. It has become almost the system. There's a book, the title is The System Made Me Do It. So even if you are an upstanding person, and you are against corruption, you cannot avoid it. You'll be forced to do it. You talk to businesses and you talk about how they're being blackmailed, by media sometimes, by NGOs, let alone by influential political activists, political figures, official figures. You talk to the average citizen going around, Panjariya kam Panjari duam, from that window to the other window, paperwork. So it has become the life. And as you said, but everyone is also against corruption. So what is wrong? And Iraq still ranks among the most corrupt countries in the world. So something's got to give. And we heard the Prime Minister yesterday say that corruption has become a pandemic. That is in search for a vaccine. And sometimes we also compare it to a national security threat. Well, if it's like ISIS or if it's a pandemic, then it cannot be left to a bunch of panelists to resolve it. I think it needs a whole of government approach. It needs also a societal approach. And I mean, obviously this panel is not here to make friends. And I think we all, whether we like it or not, contribute and participate in this system. You know, I criticize some businesses. I was testing this idea with one of my friends here. I think businesses in Iraq and in the KRG have invested more time in workarounds and finding loopholes and just surviving their business rather than fighting the business, fighting corruption, being part of the community of anti-corruption activists. Being part of the advocacy against corruption. But it's also true for the average citizen who goes around. Like by the time you go and join an NGO or write an op-ed, it's easier to just find out like, you know, what second or third cousin you have in that department, and that will be the wasta, because at the end of the day, you want your license and whatnot. I think this is probably true all over Iraq, but maybe corruption in Kurdistan, specific to your question, has perhaps a unique flavor. I mean, I probably won't be angering anyone in the room to say that Kurdistan's political system is 2 regions of single-party government. Single-party governments have basically more control, more power to get things done. But at the same time, it's also easier to have those patronage networks that is the name of the game in Iraq's corruption, where, you know, a political party gets into government, gets into parliament, gets a ministry, you know, or a part of the government. I mean, you map this in your research, Renat. So I'm here and preaching to the choir. Get the resources, and then create the machinery that allows you to stay in the game, right? That's the media. That's the some armed wings here and there. So. But in Kurdistan, I think the excuse for not being able to fight corruption, because it's a single-party rule, I think is just weaker. Maybe in Baghdad, you know, the accountability can be obfuscated. You know, you come to Minister of Finance, they say, well, it's not my problem. Go ask the central bank. You go to the central bank, they say, well, actually, I don't control that. You have to go to the Ministry of Planning. I mean, they can at least play that game. But in the KRG, I think the question of accountability, you can squarely put it, you know, in an office, if not in a person.
Thank you. A lot of issues that would be great to have a conversation moving forward, as well as taking the questions. Before we do that, Yama, you've come to Iraq. You have experience in different countries with corruption. You've been here for a while. What are your observations? What can be learned from fighting corruption in other places where you have been? And just your reflections on the conversation so far today, even. How do you sort of, what can help you in your job in the UN, fighting or trying to build accountable institutions?
So before coming to Iraq, I actually worked in Afghanistan, where corruption is also entrenched and systemic, institutionalized, and that has, of course, some lessons. But I think everyone that I've heard for the last 2 days here has emphasized the systemic aspect of corruption, which means that corruption no more is acts of individuals but networks. They are no more individual action but organized form of action. They are a part of practices that are pretty stable, institutionalized, predictable, and they often subscribe to further objectives with social or political objectives of the actors. There's some redistribution can happen through those corrupt mechanisms. As you said, corruption as a system, most of the time, individuals, we are also very much trapped in it. As part of survival strategies to get jobs, to get access to contracts, etc. So the issue is that the conventional approaches that we have for fighting corruption doesn't really work. Firing and hiring people doesn't work in that case. Focusing on technocratic approaches to the use of digital solutions, for instance, doesn't really work. Simplifying procedures, you can, but it can, you often result in what we call a displacement of corruption. So corrupt networks would move to another sector. What we learn often from countries with the context of state capture and entrenched corruption is that when you design solutions that are more system sensitive, that have element of social empowerment, meaning collective action, that works better. So with my work as the UN, I'm pretty much focused on investigation and adjudication capacity with the Commission of Integrity and with the judiciary, working on both the capacity and integrity of these institutions, but also the stakeholders around these institutions. For instance, the Bar Association, the investigative reporters, and in a way that is pretty dynamic. It's not most of the time you see workshops, capacity building workshops happening just as one, in a very static manner, one time and disappears. No, this is very much building on elements of information that's also coming from these institutions. I have a trial monitoring program that is implemented by the UNAMI's Human Rights Office, which is looking at all major corruption cases in a systemic manner. The findings of those directly inform the capacity building program that we have. So for instance, we realized that cases of illicit enrichment were not that many in those investigations. So we provided a number of capacity building workshops to the investigators of the Commission of Integrity. And similarly in other areas. Recently we discussed with the federal and KRI Commissions of Integrity about the use of forensic audits, forensic accountants, and digital forensic expertise, which is an emerging area in the anti-corruption sector for enhancing investigations. But we also realized by doing this that we are sort of challenging the practice, the legislation, and the boundaries of thinking and knowledge that we have, which means that we have to come with further solutions. And luckily, in the city, Sulaimani, 3 days ago, we came up with a solution with the KRI Commission of Integrity and the Ministry of Higher Education to work on digital forensic lab capacity with certification that could be admissible in court. And I hope that we will be able to also have a similar approach with the Federal Commission of Integrity. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us some insights into the work the UN is doing. I would like to remind everyone that you send your questions to an app and then I can read them on this thing and ask the panelists. But I wanted to come back to Judge, head of the Integrity of Commission. You're on the front line, not just fighting corruption, but for Iraq's democracy, as you said. Simona talks about a problem in your institution. The people who work for you are either scared in a climate of fear, or they have top cover from political parties, and that allows them to do the work. How do you engage and try and fix that problem?
حقيقة صدق الله عندما قال سبحانه وتعالى ولكم في القصاص حياة يا أولي الألباب. العقاب واجب والمساءلة واجبة لكل من ارتكب جريمة. أنا صريح، تخوين أجهزة الدولة التي تعني بمكافحة الفساد والقضاء وتسييس عملنا هو جزء داعم للفساد. يزعل من يزعل، يرضى من يرضى. لازلنا في خطوات الأولى لمحاسبة متهمين عن جريمة كبرى هي سرقة الأمانات الضريبية، وعندما نصل إلى المستوى الأعلى من المتهمين نخون. عندما كنا نعمل مع المتهمين الصغار لم نخون، لم يقولون عمل هيئة النزاهة مسيس. أو القضاء. عندما وصلنا إلى الدرجات العليا من الوظائف أصبحنا مخونين ومسيسين. عجيب، أنا لا أقبل هذا العمل. الفكر لا سيما يأتي من دول تقدمت في هذا المجال. العراق ليست الدولة الوحيدة فيها فساد. أنا كنت في الشهر 12 الماضي في المملكة العربية السعودية، أنجزنا اتفاقية الدول الإسلامية لمكافحة الفساد، انفاذ القانون، وطرح لي رئيس الهيئة، هيئة مكافحة الفساد، الرقابة ومكافحة الفساد السعودية، كيف استحصلوا على أكثر من 300 مليار دولار خلال أقل من شهر من مكافحة الفساد. فإذا الفساد يوجد في كل دولة ويكافح في كل دولة، ولم تتهم تلك الدول بتسييس إجراءاتها. عندما نقوم بإجراءاتنا في العراق تتهم بالتسييس، وهذا جزء داعم للفساد. وإذا بقى الحال على هذه سنعمل في فضاء فارغ ولن نحقق شيئا، لأن الفاسدين يهربون خارج العراق ويحصلون على الدعم الدولي، يسرقون أموالنا وتستقبلهم مصارف وبنوك دولية ودول واقتصاديات دول، وتحتضن تلك المبالغ وتمتنع عن إعادتها لدولة العراق أو لجمهورية العراق، ويقولون أنتم تسيسون إجراءات مكافحة الفساد. لا والله، لو كانت هذه الدول في مجال مكافحة فساد حقيقية معنا وباتجاه مكافحة الفساد في العراق لحققنا إنجازات كبرى. أما أن الدول تحتضن كبار الفاسدين وتحمي كبار الفاسدين وتسرق أموالنا، هي تسرق أموالنا تلك الدول ولا تعيدها إلينا، ويقولون إجراءاتكم مسيسة، عندما تصل إلى الدرجات العليا من الفاسدين نقول مع الأسف أننا لا نتعامل في فضاء مفتوح وفي فضاء حر، نتعامل في فضاء فيه ألغام، فيه عقبات، لن نحقق شيئا في هذا المجال. نقول كيف سرقت مليارات، 4000 مليار دينار عراقي في وضح النهار؟ أين كانت الدولة؟ أين كانت الحكومة؟ عندما نسائل الكبار في الحكومة تقولون مسيسة، عندما نحاكم ونسائل الصغار لا يتكلم أحد. وهذه عقبة من العقبات التي يضعها الإعلام والمؤسسات الدولية التي تعني بهذا الموضوع أمامنا. نحن نشكر المنظمات الدولية، عملت معنا كثيرا، الأمم المتحدة كذلك، منظمة الشفافية، كل المنظمات التي قدمت لنا العون نشكرهم على ذلك، تطوير وتثقيف وتدريب وتعزيز ودعم تقني كثيرا، لكن علينا أن نحصل منهم على الدعم المعنوي. عندما نتقدم خطوة باتجاه مكافحة الفساد عليهم أن يقدموا لنا دعما في ذلك، ويقولون لنا تقدمتم خطوة أو تراجعتم خطوة، علينا أن نكون فاعلين في هذا المجال. العقبات التي أمام هيئة النزاهة طبعا كثيرة، وإحنا حقيقة عندما نسمع هذا الكلام في الإعلام وفي ربما قنوات دولية فكرنا كثيرا حتى نخلص من هاي مسألة التسييس وهذه، وتوجهنا نحو مسألة التضخم والكسب غير المشروع. قلنا خلينا نأتي للأمور في نهاياتها وليس في بداياتها. نسأل المسؤول، نسأل المواطن، ما عنده تضخم لكن المسؤول عنده تضخم، من أين أتت لك هذه الأموال الضخمة؟ أعطينا. يعني لو كانت السماء تنزل الأموال كل إحنا هم نعمل نفس الطريق ونحصل على أموال، لكن عليها أن نثبت لنا. وعندما نأتي ونسائله عن مشروعية أمواله هم يقولون سيستم إجراءات النزاهة. هو حقيقة إحنا لا نسأله، اذهب أنت واسأله عن هذا ذلك، نترك له المجال. إحنا في القانون عندنا 90 يوم عندما نسأله عن مشروعية أمواله يثبت لنا أنه أمواله مشروعة، نضعه على الرأس والعين. لأن عندما لم يستطيع أن يثبت مشروعية أمواله التي أصبحت مليارات وملايين الدولارات، عليها أن نحاسبه ونضعه في المكان الذي حدده القانون له، وهو السجن إن شاء الله والعقاب الحاسم. لذلك أنه عدم معاقبة الفاسدين، عدم مساءلة من ارتكب جرائم بحق الشعب، عدم مساءلة من سرق المستقبل من أبناء هذا الشعب المظلوم، سقط نظام البائد. يعني كان يحدون الأمل أن نعيش عراق جديد، عراق فيه كل شيء جميل، فيه حياة كريمة، فيه معاشات، فيه لقمة عيش. لكن عندما نأتي للفساد ونجده يسرق اللقمة من فم الفقير، من فم المواطن، عندما يأتي الفساد على قطاعات تعني مباشرة بخدمات مباشر الصحية والتعليمية والسجون وغيرها، ماذا نقول؟ ماذا نفعل؟ فإذا عندما نذهب لنحاسب الفاسدين ونشدد من إجراءاتنا لا سيما الطبقة العليا، علينا أن نحصل على الدعم.
شكرا.
لأن الفاسدين الكبار مدعومين ومحميين بالإعلام وبالسلاح وبكل شيء.
شكرا.
قدموا لهيئة النزاهة ما تستطيعون لأنها مسؤولية الجميع، وعلى الجميع أن يسعى، لأن مكافحة الفساد ليست مسؤوليتي فقط، وإنما مسؤولية كل مواطن وكل مسؤول وكل فرد من أبناء هذا الشعب. العراق جميعه يخسر، ليس فقط هيئة النزاهة، وكل إنسان يخسر مستقبله وبلده وكرامته وأمواله. قوت الشعب مهدد ومستقبل الشعب مهدد. لا أقول شعارات، لكن علينا أن نحكس لكم الآلام التي نشعر بها عندما لا نجد معون لنا، وعندما نعمل نخون. ماذا نقول يعني؟ ماذا نفعل؟ نعمل وفق الإطار القانوني وفق ضوابطنا، لكن علينا أن نحصل على الدعم المعنوي حتى نقوي من معنويات كوادرنا التي تسهر الليالي، والله تسهر الليالي. فرق ميدانية متواجدة في كل مكان، فرق ضبط تعمل في كل مكان. عندما وجدنا أن الإعلام يطرح ملفات فساد مهمة، شكلنا فريق ميداني إعلامي يتوجه للفضائيات ليسجل الإخبار وهو في الفضائية لمن يقدم المعلومات. لكن تفاجأنا أكثر من يطرح ملفات فساد لا يملك أدلة ولا يملك، وإنما فقط كلام في الإعلام، وهذا شوه سمعة بلدنا الكريم العراق. العراق دولة مثل باقي الدول، فيها جرائم وفيها محاسبة وفيها شعب وفيها مجرمين وفيها شرفاء وغيرهم. من ضاق عليه الحق فالجور عليه أضيق.
شكرا.
نعم.
وشكرا. شكرا جزيلا. Zaid, turning over to you, there's a few questions coming in and from the conversation. Combating corruption is at times viewed through a legal sense. Yeah. There's a question about, does this mean changing the Constitution? Or is there a legal problem here? You know, as a lawyer, as an expert on constitutions in the region, how do you respond to these questions?
You definitely don't need to change the whole Constitution in order to make progress. It's not an absolute requirement. It would definitely be better. It's a high threshold to meet because changing the Constitution is a very difficult thing to do. You know, the amendment requirements under the Constitution are very, very high, and it's very, very strenuous, right? And there are provisions in the Constitution that are very problematic, particularly when it comes to the anti-corruption framework, when it comes to the judiciary and judicial independence. So ideally, if you could start all over again, you would definitely go back and amend the Constitution and improve those provisions. However, in the absence of the ability to do so, you could still make a lot of progress through legal reform and through other forms of reform as well, right? You know, there's even things that you could do at the level of the judiciary and even in terms of political behavior. So one of the things that I'm always very surprised by when I turn on the news in Iraq is how I see senior politicians in Iraq mingling socially constantly with senior judicial figures, right? It's not something that's supposed to be done. It's very, very inappropriate. In many countries around the world, not the United States, but in many countries around the world, the apex courts, meaning the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court in countries, are not even in the capital, right? In Germany, the Constitutional Court is in a small village somewhere, right? In South Africa, the Constitutional Court is based out of Johannesburg, whereas the parliament is in Cape Town and the government is in Pretoria, right? Whereas in Iraq, everything's in this tiny little circle in the capital. And not only that, but they're always like in these conferences and on television together, in political meetings as well together, within political blocs, et cetera, et cetera. So even at the level of political behavior, you could create a much clearer division between one side and the other. And if I could just also tie part of the conversation together as well with what Bilal was saying, if you permit me as well. So Bilal, we also had the opportunity to discuss this morning as well. So Bilal mentioned the responsibility of the private sector, and of course, it's not a good thing, right? What's happening? They're looking for workarounds and not participating in the solution, right? But to take that even further, right, is that there are companies in Iraq, very successful businesses in Baghdad and elsewhere that have dozens, some of them have hundreds of employees, right? Those companies are not registered legally, they don't have any contracts with their employees, they don't pay taxes, and they smuggle in all of their goods, right? And they're putting themselves at huge amounts of risk. Why do they do that? Why do they do that? Because they consider that that risk is lesser than if they register properly and subject themselves to corruption and extortion and so on and so forth, right? Okay. You know, it's a huge problem. And that goes to the same point that we were discussing earlier, right? Which is, whose responsibility is it to fix this? Of course, you know, we're all responsible, right? You know, we're all from this country, we have a responsibility, we should try our best. But ultimately, it's the responsibility of the political leadership. They are elected to lead, it's their job, it's their responsibility, right? And the best example that I always point to on this issue is in the 1990s, in South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was negotiating with a white minority, right? Black South Africans and the ANC leadership was very upset with him, saying, you're making too many concessions to these people, right? And they said to him, you must stop. And he said, you elected me to lead, you are wrong, allow me to lead you, right? Where is the leadership on this issue here? You know, where is it, right? So I'll just back on that point again, and thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And Simona, I wanted to turn to you. You talked about the heist of the century, and we're talking about the private sector. You live in Baghdad. Anyone who goes to Baghdad sees a lot of shopping malls, a lot of investment, a lot of businesses. What will be the impact on the city, on the people, as finances become more difficult to send abroad? Are you noticing a change based on corruption in the city?
Well, I think we saw this very clearly during the heist of the century, that real estate prices really went up, especially in some neighborhoods in Amirat or in Mansour, where some of those involved in the scandal were laundering their money by buying up real estate. And that really had an effect on the entire neighborhood, because you saw not just the real estate prices for sale go up, but also rents. And I mean, that is something that is really affecting, I think, ordinary Iraqis. I mean, in the end, you do wonder when you see all of these mall developments, all of these restaurants opening, you do always wonder, where is this money coming from? I mean, a large part of the private sector in Iraq, let's face it, is financed through stolen money. That's what it is. Because who else has these kind of funds? Who else has been able to save up assets to actually invest in a legitimate business? Let's be honest, this does not really exist. So I think it has crowded out investment for other ordinary Iraqis. I think, you know, especially if you look at where the banking sector stands, it is impossible for anybody to actually take out a loan to open a restaurant. It's something that is very difficult. So the only people who essentially get to invest in the private sector are people who have embezzled public funds. And that is the reality. It drives up the cost for everybody else. It disincentivizes honest businessmen for trying their luck in this economy. And in the end, I think much of the private sector that we see in Iraq is not a genuine private sector. It is a money laundering business.
Thank you. Bilal, a question perhaps to you, a bit academic, let's say. You talked about the patronage networks and the system and corruption. What is the relationship between corruption and muhassasa?
I think muhassasa is basically the Iraqi term that we coined, kind of a catch-all phrase, but it is the patronage system, right? Initially, it was a muhassasa of like identity-based, in which like you look like me, you pray like me, you wear a ring like me, or not. But nowadays, I think the hierarchy and the network nature of patronage has become increasingly personal. Like from a sectarian loyalty or a partisan loyalty, it's now more really personal. And I think that's also a dynamic that's really growing in the Iraqi political culture, political system. You see it more in Kurdistan than you see it in the rest of the country, but it's definitely moving in that direction. So if we're talking about political institution or state institution, I think 10 years ago we used to have strong political parties with strong institutions, but I think even those are losing ground. They're being eclipsed by, strong men. And I think that's going to make the challenge of fighting corruption even harder because, again, to just speak professorially for a second, but then I have a policy wonk comment to make as well, because the judge mentioned the role of international community. So if I can make a comment on that. I would argue that in Iraq, usually in academic literature, they say that you need two things. The two pillars of fighting corruption are transparency and accountability. I think we have a ton of transparency. I mean, just go read Simona's stuff. That's transparency for you. And if you actually want even more transparency, then just watch Ahmed al-Bashir. I mean, the guy is killing it, right? Actually, on that note, I'm going to speak to the camera. Hey, Netflix, I invite you to come to Iraq because there is a ton of material for you, and it's already been written. The script is ready. Okay, moving back to the forum. The transparency is there, but it's accountability that's missing. It's accountability that's elusive, and that's where the role of institutions come in. The judiciary, the public integrity, but I think also public accountability. So on that, just segueing from that to the role of international community, I totally hear the judge on the negative impact of the outside world. There is a whole book actually written on this by the founder of Transparency International, Frank Vogel, called Enablers, The Enablers. And yes, it talks about the banking system. It talks about like the money laundering machine that operates outside the borders of these countries that really enable this. And actually, I'd use this opportunity to comment on a law that President Barham Saleh presented to a bill presented to the Parliament that focuses specifically on repatriating those assets. I think that should be a priority for the Parliament because that really involves not only local laws and local accountability, but that transcends Iraq's borders. However, the international community has also been rather positive and productive at times. Much of the naming and the shaming of corruption in Iraq actually comes from outside. If there's a local NGO or a local talk show, you won't get as much attention as the Transparency International ranking or a report that comes out of the US State Department. So that naming and shaming aspect work. A local newspaper versus the Guardian piece that, again, I'm referring back to the excellent investigative journalism that Simona and Jane Araf and others are doing. So that gets attention and that gets just more kind of bang for the buck in the local media. So that's kind of one positive. I think a second positive, let's not underestimate the monumental impact that the U.S. pressure on the central bank and on the reforming of the banking system. I mean, I cannot see any local drive on the Iraqi political system to fix and remove the dollar auction. I don't think that would have been possible with the current and the internal dynamics. There is just not enough understanding of the banking system, let alone enough pressure on the banking system to do the kind of reform. I think if it wasn't for really the arm twisting of the Federal Reserve and of the Treasury, and of course that ties into greater issues of sanctions and money laundering and terrorism financing and all of the OFACs and whatnot, it could not be there. And again, I'll give you another example where it's positive. It's the Magnitsky Act sanctions, which has gotten to some Iraqis.
Thank you, Kak Bilal. We have just a few minutes left, and certainly we will look at the impacts of sanctions and all of this, hopefully continue the conversation. Certainly as researchers on corruption, it's very easy. Everyone gives us information on others, so it's very easy to do research on corruption in Iraq. It is transparent
do the job for us, right?
in a way. Finally, we have 2 minutes. I have this thing, people yelling at me. But Yama, your reflection sort of in a minute or two, if you may. We've talked about repatriating. We've talked about social pressure, social media. We've talked about technology. If you were to think of one of these many solutions that could work in Iraq based on your experience of the context and in Iraq, where would you focus your attention?
I think I will pick up on the last conversation about the use of international leverage and how you can expand beyond naming and shaming simply. A lot of the efforts that you can see where you garner some success in the recent years has some element of international scrutiny or standards set by an organization that is outside of the domestic players. Take the example of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Iraq is part of it, but is struggling, right? It's a multi-stakeholder approach where you discuss things between about the revenues between private sector, civil society, and state institutions, but the standards, of course, are set by the EITI Secretariat. Open government partnership, Iraq is not part of it. I would invite Iraq to join open government partnership, because that way you can have a coalition between civil society and public institutions, reform-minded officials who come up with the roadmap of reform and actually do the work I was referring to at the beginning of collective action that can be sustained beyond isolated reforms.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the speakers. This has been a fascinating conversation, and hope one that continues with everyone. Thank you to AUIS, to Dr. Barham and Dr. Mack for facilitating this important conversation, and thank you all for your questions and for participating.
Thank you, Renat. Please remain seated. Our next panel will start shortly.